Welcome back, everyone. So today we're going to continue looking at Pur Shariati's book, which deals with the decline of Iran in the 7th century. Now, there are 4 different elements that I'm going to be looking at today, and I suppose what they all have in common is finding terra firma amongst the historical quicksand. This is obviously a really important aspect of our inquiry. Very often things are in sort of quagmire, and it's hard to be 100% certain on things, but it's really good if we can find solid ground here and there. So the 4 areas that we're going to look at today are: what was the nature of the conquest of Iran in the 7th century? Obviously a very key point on which everything else hinges. Secondly, was the Sasanian Empire as centralised as we often think, or was it decentralised? This is obviously an important thing, because if we think it was very centralised and there was one ruler and everyone was united, then the only thing we can conclude is that the Arabs had a miraculous conquest of Iran, because there's no other way of explaining how they did it. But that would be to misunderstand exactly what was happening in the early part of the 7th century in Iran. Third thing that we'll look at is a curious parallel between Sasanian revisionism of the national narrative and that done by the Abbasids during a similar time frame. I think this is really interesting. It might be explained by the fact that maybe the Abbasids came from Iran and they were following methods that were in vogue in Iran, which was to change narratives to suit your own interests. The Sasanians were interested in painting away, whitewashing, perhaps is a better way of putting it, whitewashing away the Parthian part in their common history. And why would they do that? Well, to basically assert their own right to rule. Fourth thing we look at is: can the narratives of the Arab conquest of Iran be trusted? Do they offer a dependable historicity? So, buckle in. We're going to have a look at each one in turn. What was the nature of the conquest of Iran in the 7th century? I think a good way of summarising the reality of it is this line from a Bob Dylan song: "Things have changed. Don't get up, gentlemen. I'm only passing through." What do I mean by that? Well, as Parvana Pur Shariati says in her book, we shall argue that the Arab conquest of Iran ought not to be viewed as a total overhaul of the political structures of Iran in late antiquity. For while the kingship of the House of Sassan was destroyed as a result of the onslaught of the Arab armies, the Pahlav domains and the Parthian power over these territories remained predominantly intact throughout the Umayyad period. The Arabs' primary aim was to gain access to the trade entrepôts, not to extend their administration. As she says, the primary objective of the Arab conquerors was not the actual conquest and colonization of Iranian territories, but to bypass these in order to gain access to the trade entrepôts in Transoxiana. Most people, when they discuss the 7th century, imagine that the Arab armies came in and put their own rulers on the throne in Iran. This is not the case. They were very happy to allow Parthian rulers to rule in their areas and so forth. As long as the Arabs were allowed access to the various trading posts, they were happy to let that run. Eventually the Iranians converted to Islam, but this didn't happen overnight. So in the meantime, the Arabs got what they wanted. And what did they want? Well, essentially they wanted access to all the key points along the Silk Road There are a few on this map that you can see. Merv is obviously an important one. With access to these, it allowed the Arabs to make loads of money in the exchange of goods between the East and the West. And that was more of interest to them than just simply the conquest of physical land. They were in it for the money, essentially. Later, a more complete conquest was sought after. And in earlier videos, I've looked at the dispatches that were made to China looking for help. At that time, we're talking about the 8th, 9th century, the Arabs became a lot more interested in a more complete conquest, and they were willing to use violence for that. And that's when the Iranians realized that the game was up, that it wasn't as it was before, where the Arabs were happy just to have these trading posts. Shahnameh gives us an insight into what happened in the 7th century from the Iranian perspective. Sad, the son of Fakhas, invades Iran, and Yazdegerd sends Rostam, the son of Hormuz, to fight against him. Now, the Shahnameh is a book written by Ferdowsi, and it's one that you can download as a PDF if you want to have a look at it. You can, go to the relevant section. It's quite a long book, but you can, towards the latter end of the book is the area that's of interest to us. But in any case, this is what he says. Rostam writes to his brother, "They've sent a messenger who says to me, they'll leave our sovereign all his territory from Qadisiyah to the river, but for trade's sake they require a highway cut through our domains, no more than this. They'll pay us taxes, offer hostages, obey our king as theirs." So this was the initial arrangement between the Arabs and the Iranians. All they wanted was have a narrow strip running through their territory so that they could carry on their trade and leave the Iranians to rule themselves. And the Iranians were happy with that, particularly the Parthians. They were more than happy to see the back of the Sasanians so that they would have more power themselves. And this is what the Arabs banked on. Was the Sasanian Empire as centralised as we often think? So this is the second area we're going to be looking at today. People often think that the Arab conquest was nothing short of miraculous, because how could a superpower of the day be overthrown by a ragtag team of Arab marauders? But things were a lot more complicated, as we'll see. Now, there is something to the argument that there was some form of centralization going on. Pervana mentions in her book that the height of this monarchical power came with Khosrow I, 531 to 579, who implemented a series of important reforms in the wake of another surge of the nobility's power and the revolutionary Mazdakite uprisings. Through these reforms, Khosrow I was able to inaugurate one of the most splendid phases of Sasanian history. In the tradition of Ardashir I and Shapur, this exemplary king restored the normative dimensions of Sasanian kingship, a powerful centralised monarchy capable of mustering its resources in order to ameliorate and stabilise the internal conditions of the realm, maintain its boundaries, and, when appropriate, launch expansionist policies. Okay, so certainly at that time there was a move towards centralization. However, the Parthians hit the brakes on the Sasanian centralization. So she says, meanwhile, in the late 6th century, for some inexplicable reason, two major rebellions sapped the power of the centralizing Sasanian monarchs, the rebellions of Bahram-e (590 to 591) and Vistam (595 to 600). Curiously, both rebellions were launched by Parthian dynastic families. Unexpectedly, the Parthians had come to question the very legitimacy of the Sasanian kings. For a while, they even usurped Sasanian kingship. The Mitranid Bahrami Tuban forced the Sasanian king, Khosrow II Parvez, to take refuge in the bosoms of their ancient enemies, the Byzantines. She goes on to say that the Ispabutun Vistam carved, for all practical purposes, an independent realm in an extensive stretch of territory that ran from Khorasan to Azerbaijan. Even more Parthian insurgencies followed in the wake of these. Such outright rebellion against the legitimacy of the kingship of the House of Sasan was unprecedented in the annals of Sasanian history. Now you can see from the map that if they ruled an area from Khorasan, which you can see over there on the right-hand side, the east, near Merv and places like that, Bukhara, all the way past the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, that shows that they had managed to rule quite a large area. Now, the map I'm using obviously is a modern map, so I don't want to hear comments about the fact that this is not a historical representation. But I think a modern map is helpful to get a sense of the places, because obviously the boundaries have changed over the centuries and it can be hard to visualize the places in relation to the modern world. So I think hopefully this helps us to understand it better. Curious parallel between Sasanian revisionism of the national narrative and that done by the Abbasids during a similar time frame. Now, we've often considered the Abbasid revisionism as very strange, and we often wonder, how is it possible that no one raised an eyelid? Well, the Sasanians were just as good at revising their national narrative, so it shouldn't be a complete surprise that others did something similar. A common objection to the idea that Islam has rewritten its narratives to suit its own needs is it is a conspiracy theory. How many times have we heard that one? It doesn't have to be a conspiracy for this to happen. All it requires is a ruler to want the narrative to suit their own interests. No conspiracy required. Just ask the people to bend things, throw out things, and make it amenable to what they want. Surely someone would have noticed. Well, a lot of people are caught up with their own lives. A narrative gradually changes over time, and it's only a few eagle-eyed people that might notice that there's a certain bias entering into the narrative. But if the narrative is biased towards the current rulers, it's very difficult to object to that. However, we have pretty much the same thing occurring in Iran. The Sasanians verifiably and audaciously attempted to write the Parthians out of their common history to legitimize their right to rule. And the parallel is obvious. The Abbasids destroyed almost all traces of the Umayyads for similar purposes. Now, if the Abbasids came from areas close to Iran, or perhaps even in Iran, then they could easily have been influenced by the methodology that the Sasanians were using as part of their statecraft. And it would be a foolish person not to borrow someone else's statecraft if it suited your own purposes. So I think there's a good argument to be made that the Abbasids were influenced by the Sasanians in what they were doing in terms of rewriting the narratives, regardless of whether they view the Sasanians as friends or enemies. That's by the by. Everyone borrows a good strategy when they see it. Now, in relation to the Sasanians writing the Parthians out of the national history, they did that as far as possible. Poor Shariati says, while patronizing this national history, however, the Sasanians also undertook another feat. They deleted most of the annals of their defeated foes, the Abbasids, or the Parthians, who ruled from 250 BCE to 224 CE, or AD, as I like to call it, from the pages of history, cutting in half the duration of their rule. So that's one way of diminishing your opponents. Just say that they rule for half the time. She also goes on to say that Noldelki had already argued that in spite of this Sasanian censorial effort at deleting the Abbassid history, the accounts of particular powerful Parthian families do appear in the pages of the Iranian national history. Now, before we go further, just to give you the dates there so you can compare. The Sasanian dynasty began in 226 right up to 650. The Parthians ruled just before them. Poor Shariati goes on to say that a corollary of this present thesis, therefore, is that while the Sasanians were successful in deleting Abbassid history, they seriously failed in obliterating the history of the Parthian families from the pages of history. So I think what she means there is that from the bird's eye view, the Parthian history was deleted, but on the ground, family lore, stories of the various smaller families among that story, that was retained, such that we can reconstruct the history from that. She goes on to say the Sasanians were unsuccessful in this attempt because the Parthians co-authored substantial sections of the Hawade Namag traditions, and they did so during the Sasanian period and most probably afterwards as well. Can the narratives of the Arab conquest of Iran be trusted? Do they offer a dependable historicity? Now, if you were to ask me this question a few weeks ago, I would have said absolutely not. These stories are all made up because there's such confusion with dates. It makes me suspicious. Now, to poor Shariati's credit, she's made me rethink this, because even though the dates are wrong, we can reconstruct the correct dates if we look at the reign of the kings and queens in Iran at the time of these conquests. So I'm liable to trust her on this one due to the extensive research that she's done, and we'll obviously be looking at that in more detail in later videos. Now, she mentions that the last magnum opus on Sasanian history was Christensen's L'Iran sous les Sassanides, published in 1936. There hasn't been much on it since, but the unfortunate thing is it led to an unthinking acceptance of the standard narrative that had the Arab conquest begin in 632. So when we see 632 appearing, in so much of the Islamic narrative, particularly Muhammad dying 632, the conquest starting 632. Well, one of the people we have to blame for this is Christensen, because he set up the idea that it really took place in 632. And no one questioned that for decades afterwards. For 90 years, it was pretty much uncontested. She goes on to say, for him, as for all subsequent scholars of Sasanian history, the period from 628 to the last feeble Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, 632 to 651, was simply too chaotic to be amenable to any systematic research. Christensen's magnificent opus, therefore, stopped with the ascension of Yazdegerd III, which was presumably when the Arab conquest had begun according to him, and subsequent scholars of Sasanian history. So they basically followed him like sheep without questioning it critically. Now, furthermore on the Arab conquest of Iran, she goes on to say, on the face of it, the saga of the Sasanians in the last decades of their rule seems to defy any understanding. From the deposition of the powerful Khosrow II in 628 AD to the accession of the last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, in 632, no less than half a dozen monarchs are officially counted in the roster of Sasanian kings in a period of about 4 years. Tabari lists 8 kings and 2 queens. It has been suggested that some of these ruled simultaneously. Exasperation has been voiced over how little we know of these rulers. Now try and get your mind around this 4-year period, 628 to 632. According to the Sasanians, their records, there were half a dozen monarchs during this period. Tabari mentions 8 kings and 2 queens, so 10 monarchs during this period. You imagine 10 monarchs in the space of 4 years. That means that some of them were only ruling for a few months. This is a period of utter chaos where you don't have strong rulers. Rulers ascend the throne and then are killed or pushed off the throne. There's internecine warfare going on among the Iranians. The Parthians are basically trying to push their people forward to sit on the throne. The Sasanians are doing likewise, and there's no clear popular ruler. There's no strong ruler in place. And of course, this is an easy time for the Arabs to basically send their troops, their hordes into Iran and take advantage of the chaos. And so basically they caught them with their trousers down, essentially. And this is something we haven't really thought about enough before. We just assumed that the 632 date and afterwards was when the Arabs conquered Iran. But we were missing the obvious all along, the fact that the chaos occurred in the 4 years before. Now, it's not that Yazdegerd was a strong ruler, but certainly things settled down after he took power. But to some extent, he was only a young boy when he became king. But prior to that, there were just so many different rulers that there was no clear vision there in Iran. No one person to basically take the reins of power and unite all the clans to keep the Arabs out, and that's what occurred. Which were the factions who spearheaded the candidacy of these monarchs, however? To date, no systematic effort in elucidating the tangled web of Sasanian history at this crucial juncture has been undertaken. The picture has been deemed too chaotic to be amenable to any logical disentanglement. There is a bewildering array of Iranian names and personalities involved in this crucial period of Sasanian history. Through the process of transmission in the course of centuries, some of these names have all but metamorphosed into illegibility. Naught cast doubt over the historicity of the conquest narratives. So, Pur Shariati says, in certain respects, Naught's analysis is representative of the consensus. In investigating the personal names of some of the commanders in the wars of conquest, names that are given in the Futu narratives, for example, Naught lumps together the order of the battles listed for the Arabs as well as those of the Iranians as mere topoi, and argues that it is impossible to say anything precise about the relation of these topoi to actual historical circumstances. Noit then proceeds to examine the names of the Arab generals involved in these battles and concludes that it is not clear if any or all of the formations and units which appear in a number of these traditions were already in existence in the early period. She goes on to say, with very little investigation, he proceeds to argue that the description of the opposing side, especially the Persian side, we have to do with pure fiction. So he's basically writing it all off as fiction, cannot be established as history. But however, she suggests not to dismiss it out of hand as fiction. She says the present study will take serious issue with this aspect of his thesis. We cannot afford to continue to reckon with this period of Iranian history in a vacuum that has been occasioned by our own lack of research, and where, as Knott himself admits, we're given detailed and unique information, it behoves us to investigate such information in depth before dismissing it as fiction or the result of a fertile imagination of, for instance, bin Umar, through whom posterity has received some of these traditions. One needs only to browse the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi in order to come across battle formations throughout the text, an observation that cannot be dismissed on account of Ferdowsi's poetic imagination. In fact, as opposed to considering the explicit information given on Sasanian battle formations in the conquest accounts as a mere topois, we should reckon it an extremely valuable tool for deciphering the identities of the leaders of the factions involved in the Sasanian war efforts at this crucial juncture of their history. She goes on to say the Sasanians kept records of their campaigns. To argue that the credibility of these statements, in which the names of the commanders and their battle formations have been given in specific battles, is weakened by the occurrence of rhyming names such as Bandaway, Terraway, is only to betray unfamiliarity, replete in studies of the late antique period, with the Iranian side of events. Bandaway, whose name is in fact misspelled to utter illegibility, easily rectified with reference to Justice Iranish Naman Bush, apologies with my pronunciation, was in fact Vindu Yi. Terraway, that is Teru Yi, is a theophoric name after one of the Yazatas of the Iranian religious pantheon, Tyr, and the suffix Uyi contained in the aforementioned names, as well as in others such as Chiruhi and Gurd Uyi, is regularly used in Iranian names. Ironically, both Vinduyi and Tiruhi were historical figures, and none other than the sons of the Parthian dynast Vistam of the Ispa-Bhutan family. The names of these figures rhyme because they use suffixes prevalent in Iranian naming practice. So I think that's a good case in point that a little bit of local knowledge helps in avoiding making schoolboy errors. She goes on to say, the Futu narratives, primarily those of Tabari, are based substantially on traditions of bin Umar. All of the Futu accounts of this period of Iranian history contain a serious problematic, however, their chronology, while Saif and sources that follow him provide significant information about this period of Iranian history, 628 to 632. They give these while detailing the initial conquest of Iraq dated to the years 12 to 13 AH or 633 to 634 under the presumed command of Khalid bin Walid and Mutana bin Harita. So that's it. leave your comments below. Do you agree with her idea that the scholars who basically dismissed the narratives as fictional because they simply thought the rhyming was too convenient? Do you think she's right there? I think that's a quite compelling counter-argument against the idea that the whole thing was fictional. We're going to look into her revised history in due course. So expect another video in the next week or two. Thank you all for watching, and talk to you all very soon.